Hello Overclockers, I'm APAC, Head of R&D here at Overclockers UK. In the video today, I'm going to be reviewing the new Threadripper CPUs by AMD, and more specifically the 9XXXWX range. And the ones I'm going to be covering in this particular video are the 32 core, the 64 core and the massive 96 core units. On each one of these CPUs, I'm going to cover stock performance, PBO2 and overclock performance. And within these results, I'm also going to cover how much power the CPUs are drawing and the temperatures, and obviously give people advice on how to keep these things cool whilst getting the maximum performance. So, if you want the best video on YouTube about these crazy good CPUs, check out the rest of the video. And that all being said, let's get into it. So, firstly, let's discuss what Threadripper Pro is. This particular CPU, the Pro version, fits into the STR5 socket, exactly the same as the non-Pro version. The supporting chipset of the Pro CPU are the WRX90, the TRX50, where you lose some of the professional features, and the Pro 965. So what does the Pro CPU have that the non-Pro doesn't have? Well, basically it has 8 channels of memory, so it's an octo-channel CPU, whereas the non-Pro version is a quad-channel CPU with 4 channels of memory. So obviously the 8 channels of memory are generating the possibility for higher memory bandwidth, higher memory performance, and also higher memory capacity. On this particular CPU, on the WRX90 flagship platform, you can have up to 2 terabytes of memory. On TRX50, that's limited to only 1 terabyte capacity because you can only install 4 DIMMs versus, of course, 8 DIMMs in octo-channel. The other major difference between the Pro and the non-Pro CPUs is the PCI Express lanes, and on board this particular CPU, no matter what guise you get, 32, 64 or 96 core, you have a massive 128 lanes of Gen 5 PCI Express compatibility, which can be divided however the user sees fit across the motherboard. So they may want to install 7 GPUs all maxed out, or they may choose to split that up differently between GPUs, networking and storage. But those lanes are there for use and can be maxed out on the WRX90 chipset motherboards. So firstly, let's discuss the AMD Threadripper Pro 9975WX. This particular model has 32 cores with SMT, so therefore, given the proper software support, can run 64 threads at any given one time. The base clock on this CPU is 4 GHz with a maximum boost of 5.4 GHz, given that the CPU stays below its TDP or default TDP of 350 watts. This particular CPU has 128 megabytes of L3 cache and is on the latest Zen 5 architecture. Zen 5 being exactly what the mainstream Ryzen CPUs have been on for a while now. The retail price of this CPU is $3,679.99. Nextly, let's discuss the 64 core variant of this Pro range, and that suffix is 9985WX. This CPU also has SMT technology, so the 64 cores, given the correct software, can double up to use 128 threads. The base clock on this CPU is also 3.2 GHz and it has a max boost frequency of 5.4 GHz when, of course, the threaded load is low and it's not exceeding the TDP of 350 watts. This CPU also has 256 megabytes of L3 cache and is again of Zen 5 architecture. The retail price is £7,169.99. And finally, the biggest core count CPU in this range, the 96 core CPU, which also has SMT technology and 192 threads. This model is the 9995WX Threadripper Pro. The base clock on this CPU is now 2.5 GHz with a maximum boost of 5.4 GHz. Obviously, again, the boost will be maintained so long as the TDP at stock is kept equal to or below 350 watts of default power. The L3 cache on this particular CPU has now been increased, of course, in line with the core count and is now 348 megabytes. Again, the CPU cores themselves are of Zen 5 architecture, so the latest AMD core. The retail price of this CPU is £10,510 exactly. So the test bench for these particular 3 CPUs that I'm reviewing within this video was fundamentally the same for each CPU. I used the WRX90E Sage Motherboard by ASUS, and I had to update, of course, to the latest BIOS for compatibility with these CPUs. So that is important for anyone who's looking to buy this setup. They will need to update the BIOS on the motherboard, from the current shipping BIOS to be able to actually run the CPUs, and you can do that by downloading to a USB drive and using the BIOS flashback function on the back of the motherboard. So I got the ASUS WRX90E Sage motherboard. Like I said, I used that to test for this review, and I flashed the BIOS, of course. I installed 8 sticks of 4800 megahertz, 8 gigabytes per stick of memory, so a total of 128 gig. I used 8 sticks, of course, to make sure that we enabled the octo channel compatibility, and we got the maximum amount of possible memory bandwidth by doing so. The cooling that I used on the system was the Nexus Threadripper block with the Nexus pump and a triple radiator. What I discovered actually was that the block was working absolutely fantastically and the temperatures were scaling correctly all the way up to around 900 watts of power draw, which is what effectively the 96 core was yielding when you overclock it. And what I'd recommend for overclocking the 96 core is actually a larger radiator than a 360, ideally something like a 480, or if your case can accommodate it, maybe even 2 360 rads in kind of a serial approach there would really help to get the temperatures of the CPU down and also maybe add some overclocking headroom. Finally, I guess it's important to mention that my standard benchmarking suite for CPUs does include VRAY, or the standard VRAY benchmark that can be downloaded from multiple sites. But if you run this VRAY benchmark just on the CPU, anything above 32 cores wasn't particularly scaling. So when I do read out the results for 64 core and 96 core, there is that caveat to those results that really the amount of cores is no longer helping on that particular benchmark. On all my other high-end desktop benchmarks, the more cores, more frequency that you throw at a CPU, they are all scaling as you would expect. So, firstly, let's look at stock performance of the latest generation, or the 9xxx Threadripper, versus the last generation, or the 7xxx Threadripper Pro. And let's firstly compare the 32 core part. So when comparing the 9975WX versus the 7975WX, what we saw was the temperature overall decreased generation on generation by 2.28%. The power draw was exactly the same. R23 Cinebench single core increased by 13%. R23 multi-core increased by 15.6%. R24 Cinebench increased by 12%. VRAY was up 6%. Corona 1.3 was up 10%. And Blender rendering was up 17.71%. So generation on generation on the 32 core part, we saw a 12.4% improvement in overall performance. When comparing the 64 core part, that's the 9985WX versus the 7985WX, we saw again improvements across the board. Temperature improved by 2%. The power draw was the same. Single core performance was up 12.6% on R23 Cinebench. On R23 Cinebench, multi-core performance was up 14.9%. Cinebench R24 was up 5.1%. VRAY was up 6.5%. Corona 1.3 was up 22.8%. And our Blender rendering test was up 18.9%. So overall, the generation on generation improvement on the 64 core part was 13.5%. And finally, the 96 core part, that's the 9995WX versus the 7995WX, We saw a temperature decrease of 4%. Again, the same power draw because it's a locked TDP of 350 watt. We saw in the R23 single core benchmark a 13.3% improvement. The R23 multi-core improvement was 14.6%. Cinebench R24 was 10.4%. VRAY was 0.01%, but I guess I explained that earlier about the scaling on that particular benchmark and heavily multi-core loads. Corona, we saw a 20.8% improvement, and Blender rendering a 17.7% improvement. So overall, the 96 core part saw a 15.3% more in performance. Now, if we look at the results of those three CPUs together, what we saw is the generational gains of these Threadrippers is between 12% and 15% from 7000 series to 9000 series. These gains are all to be had with exactly the same power draw as the previous gen and slightly better, but definitely better temperatures too. So basically, 9,000 versus 7,000 is a win-win-win situation. So that's a pretty solid improvement generation on generation. And I believe with the compatibility with my higher memory speeds of the new Threadripper, and when we explore that, we'll see that generational gain go higher. But that's for a future video. So we've got the stock performance out of the way. Let's now look at overclocking and PBO2 tuning. For PBO2 tuning, all three of the CPUs are basically set up in very similar ways and ensured stability in very similar ways. Basically, I enabled the medium load boost feature on the motherboard. I ended up at a 5x scaler with a negative offset curve of 15 across all the cores. So we're really able to max out the PBO2 settings available on the ASUS motherboard, and obviously when selecting what the particular limitation was, I set the motherboard as the limitation so that the CPU could take advantage of all features within the motherboard and could really max out the extra power that the ASUS can deliver. Again, under this particular condition, I noted quite high power draw and also that maybe more radiator space would help with PBO2 tuning. My general testing of power draw and the whole stability of the system was done by using a Blender render test that typically takes like 1 hour on mainstream CPUs, but came down to like 9 or 10 minutes on these CPUs, but I'll loop that over 10 loops. So it was 10 loops of 10 minutes per example on a 96 core. So it was still making sure that the Blender test was running for an extended period of time so I could make sure that temperatures were accurate, the stability of the CPU under such heavy loads was accurate, and of course that the power draw was accurate. So all that testing methodology being discussed and a couple of caveats being discussed, now let's get on to our PBO2 results from the tuning that I've described previously. Stock versus PBO2 settings on the 32 core part of the 9975 WX. The conclusions were the temperature went up 36.8%, the power draw was up 53%, the R23 single core was up 2.7%, R23 multi-core went up 8.9%, Cinebench R24 went up 6.3%, VRAY, which it does scale on 32 core, went up 8.5%, Corona 1.3 went up 3.8%, and Blender rendering went up 10.2% versus stock. So overall, the improvement from PBO2 overclocking on this 32 core part was 6.7%. Next, obviously I benchmarked the 9985 WX, which is a 64 core part. The temperature increased 45% on this. The power draw also increased 45%. We saw the R23 single core up 4.4%. We saw R23 multi-core up 18.3%. Cinebench R24 was up 14.7%. VRAY was actually down by 2.82%, but we've also already discussed that VRAY was not scaling on anything above or equal to 64 cores, so I wasn't concerned with that. Corona 1.3 went up 9.5%. Blender render went up 21%. So all this tuning on PBO2 for the 64 core part saw an overall increase in performance of 13.9% overall improvement. And finally, the 99 95WX CPU, this is the 96 core part, we saw a temperature increase of 57%, a power draw increase of 148%. This resulted in R23 single core up 2.3%, R23 multi-core was up 32.1%, Cinebench R24 was up 23%, VRAY again wasn't working on this part as discussed previously, Corona 1.3 was up 24.3%, and our blender rendering was up a full 30%. So overall, our 96 core part, that's the 9995WX, saw a 20.7% improvement from doing PBO2 tuning when you compare to our previous stock result. My final style of overclocking, if you like, for this section was obviously the static overclock, where each core was set to a specific overclocking speed and it wouldn't move across. It moved from this speed across our full range of benchmarks. Again, as I discussed earlier, I noted that maybe a little bit more radiator space would be appropriate when you get into 900 or 850 watts of power draw, and that my standard 350mm radiator with medium speed running fans, around 2400 RPM fans, were not quite cutting the mustard to help me to absolutely max out the CPUs. But you have to remember that a 360 Will radiator is not really designed for like 850 to 900 watts. So the block pump combination was working very effectively to help me to max out these CPUs. So now let's discuss our stock results versus static overclocked results on the 9975WX. This is the 32 core part. On this particular part, I was overclocking a static overclock to 5 GHz across all cores. And when running my benchmarks on this static overclock at 5 GHz, we saw a temperature increase of 23%. We saw a power draw increase of 42%. We saw our R23 single core decrease by 5.6%. And this is going to decrease because obviously in the dynamic overclocking states of PBO2 and stock, you do manage to get a 5.4 GHz single core boost, and here I'm locking all cores to 5 GHz. So that particular decrease is expected. But what I have to say is that no one would buy these CPUs for single core performance. They are not designed for single core workloads. They are designed for massively multi-core workloads. And if you want single core performance, the mainstream Ryzens are where you want to be landing and not these particular CPUs. So I'm not concerned in a decrease in single core performance whatsoever, because that's not what these CPUs are aimed at. What we did see was our 23 multi-core improvement of 9.8%. We saw R24 go up 6.9%. We saw VRAY on the 32 core part, which is scaling, go up 10.1%. We saw Corona 1.3 go up 3.2%, and we saw our blender rendering time go up 11%. So overall, the improvement from using a static overclock was 8.2% on this particular 32 core part. The 9985WX 64 core part, we observed a temperature increase of 59% from stock going to a static overclock of 4.9 GHz. The power draw went up approximately 50%. The single core performance went down 8.2%. The R23 multi-core score went up 20.57%. Cinebench R24 went up 18.9%. VRAY went up 4.4%, but VRAY on the 64 core part's not scaling ideally, as we discussed previously. Corona 1.3 went up over 12%. And finally, our blender rendering test went up 22.7%, giving us an overall performance improvement from static overclocking at 4.9 GHz on this particular 64 core part is 15%. And finally, the 9995WX, which is a 96 core part and a static overclock of 4.6 GHz on this one, we saw a temperature increase of 57.9%, a power draw increase of 159%. R23 single core on this one went down 14.2%. Again, obviously we're comparing 4.6 GHz to a 5.4 GHz boost. The R23 multi-core, however, did go up 32.6%, which was a great result. Cinebench R24, again a multi-threaded test, went up 24.4%. VRAY in this case went up 4.2%, but again, we've covered that previously. VRAY is not scaling properly with cores when you get to this amount of cores, sadly. The Corona 1.3 benchmark, however, went up 23.9%. Blender rendering went up 30.9%. So the overall improvement from overclocking on this CPU is 24.8%, which is a very, very solid result. So, what's my conclusions on all the testing that I've done on this new range of Threadripper Pro CPUs? Well, given the improvement generation on generation is more than you'd expect, that obviously gets the first tick in the box for whether I'm going to like the CPU. And then, of course, you have the overclocking headroom, the tweaking, and the PBO tuning that gets you exponentially more performance as you throw more and more cooling at it, which is a second tick for me. And obviously, there's a lot of free performance to be had with something like a 96-core part, where you can improve by overclocking a massive 24.8%. And this is a lot of time saved if you're using all 96 cores on things that these CPUs are designed to do. And these CPUs are actually absolutely phenomenal parts when it comes to things like CFD, FEA, simulation, rendering, game development, and these kind of massively multi-core workloads, anything that's machine learning, AI. Like I say, literally all multi-core workloads, these CPUs are absolutely fantastic and class-leading performers. And for me, obviously, it does help that for me personally to like them, that they scale both with overclocking and cooling, and they're very appropriate to my high-end, not only content creators, almost all my business customers who are doing these high-end multi-core workloads. And indeed, with these CPUs, we can configure them not just in workstation, which is of course they are popular and designed to do, but also in 2U and 4U server, supporting multiple GPUs if the customer needs that particular scenario and workload. And we have a full B2B team to back up these solutions, so please do get in contact with us if you want to look into what these CPUs can really do in a B2B solution. Also on our website, we are going to have bundles designed by myself with our cooling incorporated available from this video. So if you want to buy any of these CPUs in a bundle that's already pre-overclocked with all our settings, you can do that. And to do that, check out the links in the description below. Finally, I will be using these CPUs in my flagship systems, especially the Supernova Mark III, which has up to 7 5090s installed and up to 96 core CPU and up to 1 TB of memory. So, and finally, as always, don't like the video, don't subscribe to any of Overclockers' social media channels, or indeed any of my social media channels, because I don't even check them anyway. But do, of course, check out my guns, and if you're more interested in gaming than massively multi-threaded scores, check out my 9950X3D video. That is pretty much the greatest thing on the internet you can watch with 8-pack in it.